Good afternoon, everyone. This is Michelle Young, the Executive Director of the University Council for Educational Administration with the UCEA webinar series on educational leadership. This series, which is co-sponsored by UCEA and the Wallace Foundation, continues today with a discussion of sustaining the work beyond the grant, lessons from leadership preparation. Within recent years, recognition of the critical importance of ed leadership to school improvement and student success has grown significantly, and researchers have been able to identify key leadership activities that are strongly associated with student learning, teacher effectiveness, and school improvement. And the Wallace Foundation has played an important role in supporting this scholarship. Based on this research, districts and their preparation providers have significantly adjusted how they think about, design, and implement leadership development processes. However, many struggle to sustain their changes over time, particularly changes that were initially made possible by external funding. Recognizing the importance of this issue, our guests today, Jody Spiro, Karen Sanzo, and Anna Doherty, have sought to understand how to foster sustainability beyond grant. After introducing our three guests, we will begin. Our first guest today is Jody Spiro, who is the Director of Education Leadership with the Wallace Foundation. She began working at the Foundation as a Senior Program Officer in 2002, though her career has spanned the private, public, nonprofit, and international sectors. Previous positions have included Director of Education at the Education Development Center's New York Office of Global Learning, Executive Director of the Soros Foundation for the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union and the Baltic states, Senior Assistant to the New York City Schools Chancellor, and Director of Principal Professional Development at the New York City Board of Education. Jody's area of specialization include leadership, facilitating active learning, and systemic change processes. It's no surprise that she's the author of Leading Change Handbook and Leading Change Step-by-Step Tactics, Tools, and Tales. Our second guest is Karen Sanzo, who is an Associate Professor for the PK-12 Education Leadership Program at the Department of Education Foundations and Leadership at Old Dominion University. Karen also serves as the U.S. Department of Education School Leadership Program Communications Hub Director, where she works to facilitate cross-project communication and learning exchanges. Karen is a veteran of the PK-12 public schools, having served as a middle school mathematics teacher and an elementary school administrator. In higher education, Karen has been principal investigator for several national and state-level grants, and her grant work has revolved around leadership preparation and development, science and math instructional leadership, and formative assessments with public school teachers and leaders. Her area of research interests are leadership prep and development, university school leadership partnerships, and data-based decision-making. Our final guest is Anna Doherty. She's the director of the Danforth Educational Leadership Program at the University of Washington, where she develops school-level leaders and contributes to the work of the Center for Education Leadership. Prior to moving to UW, Ann directed the University of Texas Collaborative Urban Leadership Program, which prepares school leaders for Dallas, Houston, and Austin area school districts. Ann has directed and co-directed 3 U.S. Department of Education grants, UT program being one of them, and currently contributes to the University Council for Educational Administration's Leaders Supporting Diverse Learners project, and has co-developed a leadership curriculum module, Building a Community of Trust Through Racial Awareness. Prior to serving in higher ed, Ann devoted 18 years to the pre-K-12 public schools as a public and elementary, middle, and high school levels and special education teacher. Her research interests include program evaluation, coaching, leadership development, and district-level influence on school success. I feel very fortunate to have these 3 wonderful panelists today, and on behalf of UCA, I offer a warm welcome to each one of you. Jody, we'd like to begin with your thoughts this afternoon. Given your significant experiences in leadership development, and in particular what you've learned while working with grantees through the Wallace Foundation, what can you share with us about program sustainability?
Thanks, Michelle. Excuse me. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and especially on this topic, because sustainability is something that we at Wallace and our grantees together spend a lot of time thinking about and putting into action. So I'll give you a bit of a summary, and then we'll see where we go later on with this in the Q&A. But just starting with a definition of sustainability that we think of as the long-term staying power of a program, policy, or practice, that I guess a main point is that if you really have sustainability, it's more about a buy-in to the importance of what you're doing as opposed to a particular organization, although that's also important, but that's what we mean by in the water supply. So there's no question in anybody's mind. They just expect that they're going to get this type of training or this type of quality in their programs. So that it's not only the program that lasts, but ultimately why we're all doing this is because we want to see behavior changes. We want to see changes in principal effectiveness. We want to see changes in student achievement ultimately. So it's not just about sustaining the program or the organization. And I'm very happy to report to you one of the things that we do at Wallace is we keep track of our grantees, and we keep track of the programs that we had funded. And in this particular case, the last bullet, that after 1 year after Wallace's funding, 84% of the initiatives that had been funded were still going strong. And that doesn't mean that they existed only, it means at the same level of funding and the same level of quality, except without any of the Wallace funding. And 75%, and after 2 years, we're still going strong in those ways. And now we've just done the study again, and we've still found, even with this economy, that 75% after 3 years of no Wallace funding are still going strong. So how does that happen? Again, we, together with our grantees, have had many professional learning communities around this particular topic of how can we sustain the work. And I actually think or hope that that has contributed to so much of the work having been sustained. So on the next slide, I'm just going to very briefly outline 4 steps that collectively we've been implementing. And the first one is one actually that doesn't happen all that often. Why we put it first is the first thing that has to happen before you can even think of sustainability is that the leader has to have the readiness to sustain the work. And that's a kind of self-reflection on the part of the leader before you even begin. Am I going to be a strong enough leader to be able to sustain what we've built? The reason I say that is because the number one element here is really hard. Am I willing to identify several program elements as core or non-negotiable? I have to be willing to say that not every part of the program is as important as every other part of the program, and we need to identify those that are more important than others, that are the absolute bedrock. So that's the second point. Can I let go of the notion that every part is as important as everything else? Can I make, number 3, this is something I have to say, if anybody asks me what most people are not doing, is making the hard choices to reallocate current resources to sustaining something that's an even higher priority. I think that most times if a program has sustained, it's not because new money replaces previous money. It's because there's been a redefinition of the priority, because what's sought to be sustained is just seen as so important that the organization reallocates existing resources to it. And am I prepared to be opportunistic and revise and adapt when circumstances change? So that's the difference between, the big difference between sustainability, which is a good thing, and self-perpetuation, which is a bad thing. So sustainability is not always a good thing if the program is not keeping pace with the current needs of whatever the context is. So after if the leader is willing to do these 4 things, we go on to the second of the 4 steps, which is to describe your program that you're considering sustaining. It's really important to be specific about what you're trying to sustain, why it's important, very important to know and be able to document that it is of high quality and valued. And of course, there we are talking about data and not just anecdotal evidence. What are the results that are anticipated and from the program, and then what's the impact or the behavior change that you are seeking if your program is successful in those who are completing that program. Therefore, step number 3, sometimes people ask me, did I forget to fill in this chart? No, it's just saying there are core elements and one has to be able to identify what they are. I've had the experience of people coming to me at the last minute as they are developing a program and they realize that they don't have enough funding for the program. That's what brings them to my desk. And they say, but as they developed the program, they didn't make provision, for example, for a full-time facilitator. And I say, well, did you tell them from the beginning that there needs to be a full-time facilitator? Well, no. Well, if you hadn't identified from the beginning that a full-time facilitator was a core or non-negotiable element, then you can't expect it's going to be there when the program is finalized. So you really have to be able to say at the very beginning which elements are absolutely bedrock for the program, and just a few. Everything, it can't be a list more than 4. The last step here, which actually takes up 2 slides, is here are the basic elements. To what extent have each of these been incorporated? That you've got all the core, once you've identified elements as core, then you have to have them. And if you don't, then your chances of sustainability really go down. You have to have a supportive host organization, or what you're doing needs to be institutionalized in some way, whether it's in policies, practices, procedures. Number 3, which is not talked about all that often, but if we go back to the technique or the thought that what you're doing has to be in the water supply, then another way of saying that it has to be in the water supply is that it needs to be in the culture and it needs to be valued. It's really interesting. In Wallace's work in the first 10 years, we developed, through our grantees developed what we thought to be 24 very high quality leader preparation programs, and some of them by districts, that have sustained very significant budget cuts. And yet those leader preparation programs were not cut. And when you ask people why, it's because they say the principals in our district would have come to expect. It's in the culture, it's in the water supply. They expect this kind of training, and the district simply can't take it away because it is just an expectation. It's in the culture. Number 4, that it's staffed with skilled personnel. It's been implemented in enough places to make a difference. So it's not, in other words, it's not a boutique program. It's not an outlier. It's really something that's been proven in a number of places or areas. The next, and I think my last slide here, continuing this, is the funding analysis, which is, again, something to really take seriously. We are very explicit that funding does not equate to sustainability, and all the things we've talked about before this are essential, but of course funding is also important. And one of the mistakes that people make all the time, especially with soft money like Wallace money, is to think, well, if we were getting $500,000 from Wallace, then what we need to do to sustain this is to go to all different foundations or to the feds and try to get the equivalent $500,000. But that only delays the sustainability. It's not a sustainability strategy. One has to understand that the real costs, you need to know what the real costs are. Sometimes the real costs are higher, and if the real costs are higher than you know, then just replacing one dollar amount with another is going to actually cause you to operate in deficit and just continue to exacerbate that deficit. So the second way also is to make sure you have a whole bunch of funding sources so you're not wholly dependent on one or the other. And the third, which is a bit of a summary here, is to try as much as possible to make sure that you have hard money, annual sources that repeat, as opposed to just money like Wallace's grant money. And so let me just see if I also covered other mistakes that people make. I think the last mistake really that people make is people are generally pretty good about planning and not as good about implementing. And the old saying, the devil is in the details. When it comes to implementing, you really have to implement well. And so I would just leave you with this one advice about some tools, which is that if you go to the Wallace website, wallacefoundation.org, you will find, I think Michelle, when she introduced me, said that I had written something called the Leading Change Handbook, which is available for free on the Wallace website, and it contains tools, a whole variety of tools, but among them is a tool called the Scale and Sustainability Score Sheet, and it's quite a lengthy tool that goes into a lot of detail, asking you to rate very specific aspects of your program and how well you have planned for each element, and then how well you have implemented each element. And it gives you, it's an Excel, so it gives you different scores and different ways that you can use that to analyze. So for anybody who's interested, again, it is available for free on the Wallace website. So Michelle, I think I will turn it back to you at this point.
Well, thanks, Jody. That was a really helpful and informative way to begin our conversation today. I think the sustainability rate for the Wallace grantees is really impressive, and it almost gives the impression that our field might not have a sustainability problem, but I think I'm not quite certain that that's the case.
Could I mention just one more thing on that? The biggest factor in whether a professional development or aspiring leader training program was sustained, the biggest factor was partnerships. So the partnerships which work both ways, and I know you've had earlier webinars about this, but the districts need the providers, and the providers need the districts. And so that is, again, if somebody said to me, we can only do one thing, what is it we should think of doing? That would be my answer, is partnerships. And I just find that with most of our organizations, people are reluctant to partner because they think somehow they see themselves in competitive relationships, especially where funding is concerned. And so I would absolutely urge partnerships.
Thanks, Jody. And I think that I'd like to point out, too, that the Wallace Foundation has a number of really helpful resources on its website in the Knowledge Center that focus on partnerships. I think that some of the questions that you posed, particularly in step 1 and step 2, just sort of circling back to your high sustainability rate, it just seems that the resources that you provide and the focus that you're placing on sustainability may have something to do with your really high rate of sustainability among your programs. Very impressive. Anne, I'd like to turn to you at this point. You've had a number of experiences starting up, revising, sustaining new programs and partnerships with and without grant funding. And I'm interested in having you share some of the things that you consider to be most important sustainability considerations, and whether or not you could share some specific examples with us today.
Absolutely, I'd be glad to do that. So if you're, when we were entering in the latest grant that I was working with the University of Texas at Austin was our collaborative urban leadership project. And for that project, what we were doing is producing, very intentionally producing secondary school leaders for both Dallas and for Houston ISD, and also Harlandale was one of the partners that had originally agreed to do our grant with us as well. And just, you know, very briefly, it's interesting that Jody talked about what are those core elements, and so what I've listed here as main strategies, I would probably just tell you that I see those really as being some of those core non-negotiable elements of the program, that we wanted to take what we were doing in Austin already to produce effective school leaders and make some adjustments with that so that it would work in the context of Dallas, it would work in the context of Houston and in Harlandale, and develop specific cohorts of leaders for those districts at the secondary level. So some of those core non-negotiable elements of our program that we identified were recruitment selection, the process that we use to recruit and select applicants. It's a very rigorous selection process. We wanted to make sure we didn't lose that as we translated into these two or three other contexts that we were working with. That the program continued to be based with powerful learning experiences, and that means that we really are integrating what happens in the coursework with the field work that students do through their internships, and that linkage between coursework and field work continue. And something that we wanted to add through the grant, something that we wanted to do that was brand new, was coaching. And that really comes from kind of more of our theory of action, just that, you know, the most effective leaders, if you want effective leaders, you want reflective leaders. You want leaders who can reflect deeply on their own practice and can be very mindful in not only their own self-reflection, but also in planning and problem resolving. So those were some of the elements that we wanted to be sure were in the grant and part of that. But if you want to move to the next slide, some of the things that we had to take into consideration was, of course, you know, Austin is if you're looking at the slide, you can see a black star in Austin, and that's marking Austin, but then the other stars represent the other areas that we were going into. So these areas were geographically different from where we were, so there was some distance involved. We were about 2.5 to 3 hours away from Dallas and Houston. We were closer to Harlandale, but Harlandale is a fairly small district of about 10,000. And then you have Dallas and Houston, which are extremely large districts, so the district contexts were very different. We also found, and we were preparing for this, even as we were writing for the grant, we were aware when our partner districts agreed to work with us, that in Harlandale in particular, that the superintendent who agreed to work with us was already leaving. And pretty quickly after we had engaged in our partnership with Houston, we found out that the superintendent there was also going to be leaving. And eventually in Dallas, I think we went through 2 or 3 different lead contexts. But we were kind of thinking that might happen to us. So that was something that we were taking into consideration, is trying to develop partners at different levels of the organization so that things could go on. And then another consideration that we had was trying to look at, because these pieces were important to us, what were going to be some of those internal and external funding constraints. So what were the rules of the university that we had to be aware of? What were the rules of the grants that we had to be aware of? And then how could we leverage both internal and external funding to really sustain this scalability project? Because that's really what this the UT CULP was a way to scale up to being able to work in these other geographic areas with the school leaders of Dallas and Houston. So the next slide shows you then what we saw as one of the core elements is this idea of the coaching model. And this was the piece that we needed some of our funding for, because we had not offered coaching to our students in the past. And what we were mindful of, though, is that we didn't want to have a 5-year grant with the U.S. Department of Ed and have coaches paid for and have coach training paid for and everything else, and then at the end of the 5 years suddenly not be able to offer coaching to our interns because we didn't have a funding source for it anymore. And that kind of goes back to what Jody was saying. So we were trying to be very planful for that. So what you see here is what our proposal was for kind of the year 1, 2, and 3 rollout of adding coaching in. And we didn't have coaching in the first year of the grant because that was a year that we were planning with Dallas as our first partner. But what we did was we offered coaching training, which we had 100% grant funded. So we used 100% grant funding the first year, and we hired consultants from the Cognitive Coaching Group, and we had them train our coaches in the Austin area, and we also had money in that grant for stipends for the coaches. So we opened that up to, one of the things that we did with this was we wanted people to be reflective leaders. We see coaching as being something that helps at both ends. So both the coach learns these skills on how to be a coach, they become a more reflective leader with that, and that helps them to use that mediative guidance not only with the students that we assign them to coach, but also with others. So we see it as being a great skill set for a leader to have. And then we wanted our interns to have the experience of being coached. But so what we did was we overtrained. We trained a large cadre of people to be coaches. When we knew we would only probably need to hire about 15 of them, we went ahead and we overtrained. So we overtrained a group of about 30 to 40 people that first year. The second year, what we did was we were hiring a consultant to work with us on training, but we also had 2 of the people who were staff members at UT Culp, Scott Blackshire and also myself. We trained as trainers, so that the second year, even though it was not costing us really any less for the training, because we were still paying for one of the consultants, it was costing us about half as much for the training because we only had one consultant. We were training ourselves, so that we could then, at some point in time, lead the training alone. And with that next year, when Scott and I were doing our trainer of trainers model, we opened up some seats in the training, and we sold those seats to other people who were interested in becoming coaches. So we had people we had identified in the school districts that were going to be working with our students, but then we also we had people pay about $1,500, I think, or $1,800 to come to the coach training. And that money actually ended up paying for our coaches that year. So we went from being 100% grant funded for both consultants and stipends for coaches the first year to being able to really modify that to making us less dependent on our grant funding the next year by selling seats to the coach training. And then year 3, the plan was that Scott and I would be the sole trainers of that. We wouldn't need a consultant anymore, and that we would have the coach stipends then would be paid by money generated from other people paying for our coach training. So that was the model that we were working towards. But one of the things I mentioned earlier was this whole idea of sustainability and turnover. And I'm actually now at the University of Washington. So I'm not back there with Scott helping out with the training, and they're back to using a consultant for part of that for 1 more year. And then he'll be on his own next year to be able to offer that. So one thing that I mentioned to Michelle when we were talking about this, though, is how did this grant experience influence where I am now at the University of Washington? And again, I'd like to have my students have coaches. We have people who are currently working as retired principals, or who have worked as principals who are retired, and they come in and they serve as advocates for our students, and they work with about 3 to 5 interns each. And it's costing us about $1,500 a student to pay for these retired principals. Now that's coming out of student-generated money, but we have lots of other things that we fund as well. And so wanting to be mindful about the way that we use the student-generated money, one of the things that we're doing for this coming year, and that's what you see as year 2 on here, is that in addition to having some retired principals coach our students, we're also working with our Leadership for Learning doctorate program, and we have about 6 of our doctorate students who are going to use being a coach advocate for our students as their internship credits. So they'll be earning internship credits instead of earning money. And in that way, we're hoping to be able to kind of expand a bit about what we do with our coaching by saving some of the money and having people in a supervised internship instead of, interns coaching interns, if you want to look at it that way. So I think that that's kind of an exciting addition. Oh, and I see the slides caught up with me. Sorry, I should have signaled sooner on that. But but that's a kind of an exciting way that we're going to be able to recapture the cost for probably about 8 students. So that $1,575 times 8 students, we will be able to recapture rather than paying that out to someone who's in a stipend position. The advice that I would have for people who are going into any sort of a grant situation would be for sustainability is really thinking about this grant as though you were a business, and that you were shopping around for loan money from different organizations. Originally, you're going to ask a bank or somebody else to loan you money to get your business off the ground, but after that, you have to be able to show how you're going to be able to maintain your business without additional infusion of funding. And so that's, in a way, another way to look at this grant is that this should only be looked at as a one-time investment that someone's making in your organization. And so really some of the advice I'd say are just making sure that you know what your goals are for after the grant funding expires. What do you want to continue to be doing? How might you use that grant funding to build systems that actually generate income for you? And in our case, that one way of doing that was to have a coaches training model so that we could start offering coaching through our university and be able to charge people to come to that training and generate some funding. But there's other options that you might look at. And if that isn't possible for you, then what are some other funding options that you might have? And so I put here is there's a couple of different things that I've seen people do beyond their grants. Seattle University has been using coaching as well. And one of the things that they're exploring is having student-generated fees. So their students would actually pay a coaching fee each semester that they were enrolled, and that those coaching fees would accumulate to the point where they could pay for coaches for their students. I've seen other organizations, University of Texas at Austin Principalship Program has been exploring offering professional development in addition to coursework, and that would be fee-based, and that might help cover some of the cost of pieces that they want to continue after a grant. And I've seen other universities that have hosted conferences or keynote speakers that they bring in, and then have, again, in a way, a professional development experiences for people to be able to generate funding beyond their grants. And then I'm going to pause here, Michelle, if you want me to go on about sustainability, or excuse me, scalability, or pause for a few moments.
No, go right ahead.
Go right ahead?
Mm-hmm. All
right, if you want to go to the next slide then. We had been talking with, it's kind of interesting, I've used very similar language here to what Jody was talking about, but just in terms of scalability, and that's where we were, moving out into Dallas and Houston. We were replicating a program that had been going on in Austin for over 50 years, but was going to be a new program in Houston, and something that we hadn't had in Dallas for maybe a decade or more. And so just in terms of how do you prepare to scale up like that, one of the pieces that we did was deciding what those critical components or non-negotiables were going to be, and I had talked about that earlier, about that recruitment selection. Was part of that, those powerful learning experiences, the integrated coursework with fieldwork, and then the coaching. And then also really trying to decide how will those components be delivered when you're scaling up to additional sites. And that was something that caused us great concern as we were going forward, because our model, particularly for the first summer, looks very different from most other programs. And we had kind of an interesting piece that we took forward with that. So if you can go to the next slide there. In terms of what we were trying to do is we have a real constructivist delivery model in which the professors in the first summer are very hands-off. There's information that's given to students. They actually do a study of a school site. And so, but the professors do not step in perhaps as much as you would expect. We let the students grapple with a lot of the issues that come up during that school study, and kind of help prod them into the idea that they're leaders among leaders, and how are they going to solve any problems that come up for them. So we need people who are willing to do that kind of hands-off, backup delivery, and that's not something that you can just explain to somebody in 5 minutes like I did for you, and then expect that they can actually deliver on that. So one of the things that we found is Glenn Nolly, who had been teaching with us at the UT Austin program, he had happened to have moved up to Dallas. So that worked out really well in year one. So for scalability, Glenn was in Dallas, and he served as the lead instructor that first summer, and he worked side by side with another instructor in Dallas to deliver that first summer. As we were going into year two, where we were heading into Houston now, interesting enough, Glenn had family in Houston, and he agreed to go live in Houston for the summer, and he co-taught with Bobby Gideon, who's serving as the Houston site coordinator for that grant right now. And he helped bring Bobby up into that model of how do we do that teaching and learning from that constructivist delivery model. So I'd say that for us, the scalability really was very personnel dependent. Probably you don't want to be that personnel dependent, but for us, that's the way it worked out. And I think that we were very successful because we were able to rely on having someone who could help us, like Glenn, to get the next wave of people ready. He worked with Denise Collier in Dallas. Denise continued to teach with us the next summer, but she had gone through the model side by side with Glenn. And then, of course, Glenn taught with Bobby another summer, and then Bobby was now up to an understanding about what that model looked like. So that's what I would share with you about scalability.
Thanks so much. I think it was really helpful to have several concrete examples to apply, both some of the things that you provided as advice for sustainability as well as those that Jody, I think it's really nice the way that they've dovetailed together. And this issue of personnel, you know, I think Jody's point about partnerships is really important. Though even with partnerships, the personnel issue seems to be one of the things that can either make or break a partnership, just as it seems that it becomes a pretty critical issue in terms of sustainability and scaling. I'm very interested in seeing what Karen has to say and how well her comments either complement and add to some of the things that Anne and Jody have already provided. So, Karen, in particular, we're interested in the work that you've been doing as the director of the USDOE Communications Hub. You know, in this position, you've had a bird's eye view of some of the sustainability issues that the grantees have faced, and similar to Jody, you have also taken an interest in gleaning some lessons learned. So can you share some of those lessons with us today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to share some of the work that we've been doing with the Communication Hub over the past several years. So what I would like to do is just to give you a brief background on the School Leadership Program grant. There are currently 43 grants being funded at this time. And right now these are 5-year grants. And the most recent grants have been funded either beginning in 08, 09, or 2010. And the program's focus is on the preparation of aspiring assistant principals and principals, providing professional development for current assistant principals and principals, or a combination of both. There are school leadership programs throughout the U.S., from Florida to Texas, Virginia, California, Alaska. And these are innovative leadership preparation and development programs that have utilized the funding from the federal government to put into place activities and components that may not have been previously possible to support the development of aspiring leaders or current leaders. So understanding these grants are supported by federal funding that may conclude at the end of 5 years, the grantees do obviously hold conversations focused around how to sustain these practices once the grant funding goes away. And this is an important role that we at the Communication Hub that we have taken on. The Communication Hub has co-sponsored 2 working conferences along with the Alaska Staff Development Network for the SLP grantees thus far, and we also have another one this September in Albuquerque. And we've talked about this issue of sustainability at each conference, and we plan to dig deeper into sustainability this September, especially with 22 of the grants coming to the end of their grant cycle. We've also used monthly webinars this past year to talk about sustainability of practices from topics such as coaching, mentoring, and internships. So what I would like to do is to share just a few of the lessons learned from our conversations and research on the SLP grants. And Some of what I will share may seem obvious, but the reality is when you're involved in intense grant and program implementation, it's not always easy to think about the issues of sustainability when you're tasked with really critical day-to-day and month-to-month program activities. So we can go to the next slide. The first, I guess, the first lesson learned is to begin your program planning with the end in mind, this need for some sort of long-term plan to sustain the work you're doing after the grant funding ends. The design should be something that is sustainable in some form or another by the time you get to the conclusion of the funding. For example, we've heard coaching mentioned here. You may put a significant investment into the development of leadership coaches. If you contract with an external coaching expert, consider how you can institute a train-the-trainer model, such as Anne spoke to. So you're not only supporting your current leaders, but making a significant long-term investment in the capacity of your school employees. And consider how these now trained coaches can in turn train additional qualified coaches in order to continue to sustain the program in an economically feasible way. Ensure too that you have realistic goals, objectives, and articulated outcomes, and these will guide your project. When you receive external funding, if you're looking, if the project you have is grant funded or some other external funding, then you need to also be sure that you include that funding stream into your transition plan. If there's a modification to your goals and objectives, make modifications to your transition plan too. And we've been talking a lot about this notion of a transition plan with the grantees, what they are doing to carry on the work that they have been doing with the leadership programs. Your program evaluation efforts should help you make the transition plan modifications as you go through your program. You're able to identify what works, what doesn't, and what needs to be modified in order to help that effort when you come to the end of your funding cycle. We've had a lot of conversation about how critical your program evaluator is in making ongoing changes to your grant and using that information to help inform the direction you're going. So we can switch to the next slide. So one of the notions that we've been talking quite a bit about with the grantees is this idea that programs are cohesive systems and not individual people. Programs are developed by a team of experts, such as experts in the field of program components, experts in the schools and districts that you're working with, and then we rely on the program directors, the managers, evaluators, and other key personnel to effectively facilitate the implementation of these programs. While not always the case, program personnel do change, and especially the ones with long grant cycles, we are going to find that you're going to have personnel turnover. Someone may retire, take another job elsewhere, there may be an internal company job change. Whatever the case, we have to ensure our programs continue without a negative impact because of the loss of that person. One of the ways that the grantees have been doing this is to formalize the roles and responsibilities for each person. While this may be outlined in a grant proposal, we are all limited in the amount of pages we can submit for review. So there have been a lot of conversation about how to specifically define each person's role. It's important from a human capital standpoint to clearly outline what each person should be doing. And this will also assist with making sure that there's not duplication of work and responsibilities and miscommunication about expectations. And the idea is to transition from that design team idea to a cohesively implemented system that can be continued beyond the involvement of the original members of the team. Next slide. So we've had a lot of conversation about written documentation of the program, and this is one way that we can help with sustainability of practices and that they are actually written down. Some of the grants have put materials online, created program manuals, so there are a variety of ways that this information is recorded and documented. It's very important to not rely on only one or two people and their institutional memory of the program and how the program runs. We've seen this happen in various grants with personnel changes. So ideas, again, creating a program manual and associated documents that are used to help with the program, ensuring that everyone understands the individual program components and how these fit together into a system. I would pose the question to reflect on your current programs and how thorough is that documentation? Would I be able to walk in tomorrow and be able to begin as a member of your program team without a 6-month catch-up time. And there's always on-the-job experience that needs to come with a new person on your team, but a good understanding of the core program and its components has been really critical for those grants who have experienced personnel changes. So what I have on that next slide are just 3 transition plan examples. If you want to go to the next slide, just kind of thinking points. And we've already talked about the mentors and or coaches, and really spoke to some of what they had done with that transition plan, making sure that they had multiple site grant folks who were trained, so and another person, so even if she did leave, there was someone there who could carry that coaching component on. One issue that's a big talking point with these grants are innovative internships, how we can continue these innovative, in-depth internship experiences for our aspiring leaders while making sure that we are working with the reality of the current anticipated funding paradigm for the internships that we can implement. And then also thinking about ongoing PD for current leaders, looking at short and long-term needs, looking at the current PD format, how these grants can utilize other grants, and what the grants have learned and their internal capacity to provide professional development. We've been able to connect with a number of different partners in higher ed and as well as in school districts for different types of professional development. And we've had the opportunity to look at a variety of distance delivery alternatives rather than that traditional on-site, in-person 6-hour PD sessions. So with the last slide that I have here, what we have tried to do with the Hub is to take these over 40 individual programs, provide a vehicle for the grant partners to come together to talk about areas of success, challenges, how we're going to sustain the efforts that we do have in place that are being successful, and really looking on transitioning now. Our plan is to look at that national network, being able to continue to support these programs, to support them through conversation. Again, we have that next conference that's coming up, and helping people to have that national network and large-scale support so that we can keep the investment that we have put into the communication hub and the grant work, keep that to continue.
Thanks, Karen. I think it's really striking how important planning ahead has been within each of your stories. Though I think this last slide, Karen, is got me thinking about how important, for example, the Communications Hub, Wallace's professional learning communities that they provide, organizations like UCEA are to sharing information amongst faculty, practitioners, other preparers, so that they can understand and build capacity around sustainability, among a million other important issues. It reminds me of the work that the Carnegie Foundation has been doing recently on networked improvement communities. Very, very interesting. Before turning to some of the questions that our listeners pose, I'd like to circle back a little bit and pose a few more questions to our panelists. While I'm doing this, I'd like to encourage the listeners to use their control panel box to submit some additional questions if you'd like to. And if we don't end up with time to answer them all on the webinar, we will make sure that the questions get posed to our panelists and get back to you as soon as we can. Jody, I'd like to start with you first. And I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on how Anne and Karen's presentations fit with your thinking, as well as what Wallace is currently doing to facilitate sustainability within your current grant initiatives, particularly the pipeline project.
Thanks, Michelle. I'd be curious what Anne and Karen have to say. I thought that the 3 presentations dovetailed tremendously and were pretty seamless, actually, in terms of the degree of productive redundancy and support for what we were each saying. I thought it was really very confirming for all 3 of us. I picked out just a few points. on the two presentations, just in regard to what Anne was saying, just to remind everybody, I think you know, and Anne certainly does because she spoke about it, that funders love to fund one-time costs. And so proposals that come in with one-time costs are very attractive. So things like case study development or curriculum development or role development for the coaches, something that is going to be used well after the funder's contribution is over. And of course, specifying in a grant proposal what type of non-grant funds will be brought to bear, even from the beginning, as over the course of the grant, what funders always like to see is that the grant funding goes down as the other funding, the non-grant funding, goes up. I thought that that Anne's description of using internship credits for coaching was a really great example of what I was talking about on incorporating what you're seeking to sustain into what already exists. And I wanted to particularly comment on Karen's chart about the cohesive systems as opposed to individual people, in which case I would also add or cohesive systems as opposed to individual people or individual organizations, which again is the role of seeing whatever program it is you're seeking to sustain, seeing that in the context, the larger context of what else is going on. So if it is an aspiring leader program, then how does that relate to what the hiring needs of the districts are, or what they are asking principals to do or evaluating principals on? The ability of the program to recognize the needs in the full system of what's going on for principals. And so just then briefly to respond to Michelle's last point about the pipeline district, because it's very interesting that for 10 years we worked with this group of grantees that I've told you about, and now we have new grantees for this next generation work, the pipeline work. And what the previous generation grantees had told us was, please, with your new grantees, and this is what Anne said and Karen as well, concentrate on sustainability from the beginning. And when in our first generation, although every year we said we want to see sustainability, but we didn't get serious about it until they were 2 years from the end of their grant. And then we did a full court press with our learning community and learning together about sustainability. So the biggest thing we learned from them was to do that early and to be that specific. And it was kind of funny that at the very first meeting of the people who had just gotten brand new grants, and we said to them, the main topic of this meeting is sustainability. And you may find that counterintuitive. You're not thinking about sustainability now. You're still excited that you've got a brand new grant. But after time, they really understood why we were building in sustainability in all the ways that I just thought about. And by the way, last thing that I learned was I used to think that sustainability meant taking the grant funding down progressively each year. One of the things I learned from the principal pipeline work is sometimes the funding for a particular part of the grant will go up in the second year or the third year before it starts going down. And that's because of what I said beginning this, that you need to be considering what your one-time costs are, the development costs, and those may actually be higher in the second year. In the first year, you might not be ready to do the development of particular cases or curriculum. So that's my kickoff to the Q&A part, Michelle.
Thanks so much, Jody. So Anne, just based on what Jody just said and thinking about yourself as a grantee, Jody mentioned that they have had their pipeline district folks thinking about sustainability from day one. How does that strike you as an individual? I guess what I'm wondering is, that seems like a very hands-on, helpful, resourceful approach to grant making and also kind of working with your grantees. And I'm just wondering, what's your perspective as a grantee, and are there other things that granting organizations can do to be supportive in the way that Jody just described?
Yes, I think one of the things I'll mention is we had a U.S. Department of Ed grant, which was the Central Texas Leadership Development Alliance, before we received the UT CULP grant. And one of the things that happened as we moved from our 3-year grant with the U.S. Department of Ed, where we were developing leaders in professional development in Central Austin, to this idea of scaling up into Dallas and Houston, was we were asking for a grant for some very different things that we had asked for in the previous grant. And I just want to kind of throw this out there. We were one of 2 organizations out of the, I don't know how many, 40 or 60 that had that were given a grant that actually had one the year before, had been in one in the grant cycle before. And what we heard from U.S. Department of Ed was most people just applied for money to keep doing what they'd been doing. And that wasn't the intention of the U.S. Department of Ed grant. So if you're going for the first 3-year grant and then you want a 5-year grant after that, you can't apply to do the same thing that you were doing before and expect to be funded. So I think that sustainability is critical. We were able to show that pieces of the previous grant were going to be sustained, and then that, I think, gave us credibility for being able to say, so would you give us another grant now to do something completely different? We're still working on leadership development, but now we're scaling into Dallas and Houston instead of working on Central Texas. And we want to add in this coaching piece. So yes, I absolutely agree that that sustainability should be the first thing that you think about as you write the grant, because all that money is going to go away. And with U.S. Department of Ed grants, particularly in just the funding cycles that we've seen, even being awarded a grant for 5 years doesn't mean that that money will come in for 5 years, because there are changes in legislation and changes in budget priorities. You may find that they only fund 2 years of the grant, and then that grant funding source may get diminished, or it may be removed, depending on what Congress decides.
Thanks. Building off of that too, Karen, the transition plan examples that you provided, can you unpack that a little bit more for me, just in terms of how, is this a requirement, or is this a helpful process that you all have developed through the collaborations that the different grantees have been engaged in over the years? How'd that come about?
Can you repeat that? My mic turned off, or my headset turned off for a second.
I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the transition plans that you described. Are these transition plans something that kind of emerged from the group as something that was helpful for them to be thinking about in terms of sustainability, or was this something that was required? How is this built into the grantee experience?
Sure. Actually, this is not something that has been articulated at this point in something written. It wasn't a part of the original grant requirement. This has come about as a part of the conversations that we've had over the past couple of years. And this upcoming conference in Albuquerque, a major component is focused on sustainability, as well as the webinar series that we've been doing the past year. So what I've done here is to capture some of the conversations that have taken place around just these 3 components, but what we are hoping to do when we meet in Albuquerque September 26th and 27th is to be able to look at the more long-term transition plans and what people are hoping to do. So this really is just a part of the conversation, and we've not had it written down yet, and that's what we're hoping to do as our next step.
Well, it seems to me to fit really well with the idea of having resources and conversations and so forth for grantees as they're planning for sustainability. So it just seems like a really helpful resource. Well, unfortunately, we have reached the end of today's webinar on sustaining work in leadership preparation programs beyond the grant. And I'd like to just note that Trish Brown-Fernia, the editor of UCA's Research Utilization Brief series, synthesized a Wallace Foundation report on sustainability and pulled out some of the pertinent findings and implications, many of which Jody shared with us today. And this brief is available on the UCA website. And was also supported by funds from the Wallace Foundation. I'd really like to thank our guests for joining us today. Thank you so much, Jody, Karen, and Ann. I found your contributions to be really helpful, and I'm sure our listeners did as well. I'd also like to ask all of those who sent in really helpful questions that help extend our thinking on this issue, and let you know that we will definitely be getting back in touch with you with some answers. And finally, I'd like to thank the Wallace Foundation for supporting today's webinar. For those who have attended today's webinar, I'd like to remind you that a full recording of this discussion will be available by next week, and we encourage you to share it broadly with your colleagues. And that's the end of our webinar today. So goodbye, everyone, and we hope that you have a pleasant week and weekend. Thanks once again.